Okay, now let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed, as I talked to you about a couple weeks ago, is basically the duration for which that flap in front of the chip in the back of your camera stays open. Okay, so that there's something that's covering the chip so that light can't reach it, and when you click the button on top of your camera, that flap opens up and stays open for the duration of the shutter speed. So the shutter speed generally is measured in it's basically measured as 1 over something. So let's say your shutter speed is what you might see on the camera, and I'm going to show you an example so it might help. So here's my camera. We talked about aperture last week. Here's my aperture. It's set to 2.5 right now. I'm going to lower that. So there it is. It's set to 1.8 right now. Okay, my camera is looking down. It's going to take this picture. That's the shutter speed. See how that number 13 just appeared? That number 13, that's the speed with which my shutter is going to stay open. And that actually is 1 over 13. So it's 1/13 of a second. That's what it's saying. And if I close my shutter down, that number will go down. See, it's 1/8 of a second, which is actually slower. And I'll just keep doing it. And you'll see now it's going up. So it's actually now almost, so if I close it all the way, see it says 2.5. That's 2.5 seconds. That's really, really long. Okay? So the goal here is to have this number be as small as possible. Because the point is, and I'll try and explain this with examples, is that you want your shutter to be open for a very, very short amount of time. Because for every second that your shutter is open, light is hitting it, and if the subject you're taking a picture of is moving, then it's actually going to change, it's going to record that movement, and it's going to look like the person is all blurry. I will show you examples on my webpage when I post this video of what happens when you leave your shutter open for a long time. If what you're taking a picture of is completely steady and you have your camera on a tripod so the camera is not moving at all, then it's okay if your shutter's open for a couple of seconds because nobody's moving, nothing's moving. It doesn't matter that the light is hitting for a duration. But that's not typical. Most of the time you're the one who's holding the camera, not the tripod. Most of the time the subject you're taking is actually a human. Or even a plant, but it's outside and there's wind, so it's moving. So it's very, very important for you to try and keep your shutter speed as low as possible. Okay? And so the shutter speed numbers we've already talked about, even though it's a little bit weird. So how can you keep your shutter speed low? The trick to keeping your shutter speed low is, as we talked about yesterday or last week and the week before, is opening your aperture as much as possible. If there's a lot of light coming into the sensor won't need to keep it open for a very long time. So if your aperture is really, really wide open and a whole bunch of light can hit it at the same time, then a split second will be more than enough for you to draw your picture. So it won't be a problem, and then you won't need to keep your shutter open. Now, if you're in a little bit lower light situation and you're not able to, even if you open your aperture all the way, it's really not going to give you enough light, then you can talk about increasing your ISO, which we're going to talk about next week, which is the sensitivity to light, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. So no matter what, the most important thing you need to remember here is that you want your shutter speed to be low. Fast. So there are cases where we don't want that, but that's again for creating special effects, and we'll talk about them in the upcoming weeks. If you want blurry shots on purpose, and I'll give you some examples of that effect is created by keeping your shutter open for a long time. Or if you want to do night photography, which often results in kind of interesting shots, again, you want to keep your shutter open all the time. But when we're talking about normal daytime pictures of friends and family, events, etc., that you want to take pictures at, you really want your shutter speed to be fast. So when you're looking at your photos and you're wondering why your photos are blurry, most likely there wasn't enough light, so the shutter stayed open for longer than it should have and registered a lot of movement, which is not something that you want. All right? So I think it's important to understand what aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are so that you can then understand how the different modes in your camera work, what are the different things you can do. So that's why I'm explaining these things, even if you may never use the shutter speed yourself. Now, one trick that you should know if you do want to use your shutter speed and if you're interested in using your camera in different modes, something that I was taught a long time ago, which I think works really well, is that you want your shutter speed faster than your focal length. Your focal length is the distance of your camera. If you can see, of your lens, sorry. If you can see on my lens, see it says 50 right there. My lens is a 50 millimeter. So what that means for the case of shutter speed is that I want my shutter speed to be faster than 1 over 50. Okay, so any number higher than 50 is a good number. So if you look here, when I open my lens, even at 1.8, I get 13. That means there isn't enough light here. This is going to blur. Whereas if I actually face it towards the light a little bit more, that goes to 50. See how it's going to 60, 50, right there? Right there. See, it says 50. That's good. That means the shot will probably be clear. Okay, the higher the number, the better. I would say close to the ideal number is about 125. That's very fast, 1/125th of a second. Perfect. It'll take a very clear, crisp shot. So if you're using your camera in anything besides auto mode, I think even in auto mode actually displays these numbers. You can start paying attention to them. Yeah, so I'm in auto mode right now. And I'm going to go ahead and see how it shows the numbers. It shows you the aperture right there, 2.5, and the shutter speed right there, 80, which is perfect. Okay? It's saying that in this case, if you want to take a good shot, you want to have a 2.5 80. I normally use my aperture, I use my camera in what I call aperture priority mode, which we'll talk about later, and I set my aperture to 1.8, which forces the shutter speed to be faster. I'm not facing the exactly same way, so the numbers are not changing as much as they should. But anyway, that's the trick. So if you have a lens that instead of being a 50mm is like a 200mm, then you really want your shutter speed to be faster than 1/200, which means that number has to say 250, 280, whatever that number is, it has to be higher than 200 for you to get a clear shot. If you have a 35mm lens, then you just need higher than 35. Okay, that's a simple trick, but it actually works really, really well. I've rarely ever found the case that if you're holding your camera correctly and you have your aperture done well, if you have your shutter speed be faster than your focal length, you're pretty much set to go. You won't blur the photo. All right. I hope this helps a little bit, and as the weeks come, as we move forward, that's what I was trying to say. It'll all start making sense a little bit better. But I wanted to make sure you understood the technicals before we start talking about how to do fancier things or how the different modes work or what kind of lenses you want to buy, etc. All right. Have a great day. And if you have questions about shutter speed, feel free to leave them in my comments.